Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode, the 113th episode of not Real Hawk Talk. I almost said it. Almost said it. It's a Monday morning. I'm allowed to have a Monday morning too, of Hawk Blogger Mornings, the 113th consecutive day of fresh, new Seahawks content every single morning. Try to do it at 8 a.m. Pacific time every morning. A few minutes late today, but that's okay. Got a little bit of a late start. And it's the week before the week. I mean, the Seahawks training camp starts next week. I'm looking forward to being in attendance and getting my eyes on these guys in person and seeing how it's all going. This week, we've got a bunch of good stuff coming up for you. Hopefully, some guests and other things will materialize. And also, I'll just say, um, we're gonna start getting the Seahawks front office, all the staff back in the office today. Today's the day. I think almost all the Seahawks personnel are coming back from their vacations. So we will start to probably see a little bit of movement, if there's going to be any movement, on additional roster spots. Um, Anything else that may or may not happen might start this week. So today is a meaningful day for lots of reasons. I hope you all had a great weekend. I definitely did. I did something that I haven't done before, and maybe you all have heard of it before and done it, but I think a lot of you know I've been doing a bunch of hiking this year, and I read about the Washington Trails Association, WTA, and that they have all these volunteer work parties where you can go and spend a day out on a trail with a bunch of other people, with some supervision of people that know what they're doing, and help work on the trails, volunteer to, rebuild things, build new things, clear brush, all sorts of stuff. And yesterday I went up to uh, the Scenic Mountain Pass Loop, Scenic Pass Loop, and North Cascades near Baker, and we worked on replacing some rotted boards in some boardwalks along the trail, and cleared some brush where things had started to be overgrown, and did it with like 10 other people, all great people, great folks, probably not a lot of jerks that volunteer to spend their Sundays working on a trail in the heat, but it was a lot of fun. I can't wait to do it again. I'm certainly going to look for more spots, and maybe we'll organize a Hawk Blogger Morning, Real Hawk Talk work party at one point. If people are interested, we can try to work something out with WTA. If anyone else is interested in doing some work out on the trails, let me know. I'm certainly gonna do some more volunteer work there. The other thing that I wanted to give a little bit of a plug to, if you aren't familiar with it, is my wife Rachel and I started a different podcast. I know lots of podcasts, but it's we're having fun. That is for parents that have a child with a disability, and the focus of the podcast is just helping people find community in being a parent, either a single parent or, a couple that has a child with a disability, and some of the experiences you go through, and um, the isolation that can happen. And we've now been at it for over 20 years and just have some experience to share. Rachel is a director at a nonprofit that focuses on disability and knows a bunch of resources. So if you know anybody that is a parent, a family member, a grandparent of someone with a disability that might benefit from hearing other people talk about their experience, and also some resources to help get them the support that they might need, I encourage you to point them to the Nem House podcast. I'll post in chat a link to the most recent episode. Got 3 episodes up there. we try to keep them short, like half an hour, pretty easy to listen to. It's free. It's on Patreon, but that's just to help build a community out there. All the posts are public, free. But I encourage folks that are interested to become free members on that site so that maybe you can find some other people in the community and bring them together. So that is the Nemhouse, Nemhouse podcast. You can find it, I think, on almost all your favorite podcast platforms, although it's not working on Google Podcasts yet, but we'll see if we can do something about that. So just want to give that a plug and hope that helps some folks along the way. All right. With all that aside, let's have a conversation about Geno Smith. And if you listened to Seahawks Saturdays with Jeff Simmons, when I had him on this Saturday, and Jeff and I were just shooting the breeze about many things, one of the things we talked about towards the end of the episode was this notion that there's these really good teams. I'd throw the Cowboys out there, the Dolphins out there. There's others that obviously I could put into this, in the 49ers could be a part of that list. Really good teams that are not championship teams. And so that's where I kind of leave the 49ers out, because even though they haven't won a ring, they have made it to the Super Bowl a couple times. I'm looking for those teams like the Cowboys and the Dolphins that have some really impressive players. You got Micah Parsons, you've got Tyreek Hill, you've got these elite blue chip guys that are the best at their positions or close to it. You've got good or great quarterback play. You've got a lot of things going for you. You got CeeDee Lamb in terms of Dallas again. But what keeps you from being a true championship contender? And one of the things that Jeff and I talked about was, do your best. I kind of hearkened back to a Mike Holmgrenism. Mike Holmgren used to talk about, when he was in Seattle, that to have a championship season, your best players need to have career years. That might sound obvious, but I don't think it is. And I often find that to be a very insightful comment. You can't have a DK Metcalf having an okay year. You can't have, Tariq Woolen in a case lot. You can't have these guys step back or have challenging years. You need your best players to have their best seasons. I think that's one aspect. Certainly was the case for the Seahawks during Holmgren's era, when you could argue that was Hasselbeck's best season, although 2007 was a statistically better year. It was definitely Sean Alexander's best season, probably Walter Jones and Steve Hutchinson's best seasons, Lofa Tatupu's best season, even though he was a rookie. I thought that was probably his best, most impactful year. You can kind of go on down the line. So the other thing that Holmgren would say is, similarly, in big games, you need your best players to play their best. And we saw that almost more evident during the Pete Carroll era. Pete Carroll got his teams really juiced for primetime games. And he would say that he got them ready to play every week consistently, which I think is true as well. But that Legion of Boom era team of roster, those guys almost to a man played better during tougher games against tougher opponents. Doug Baldwin used to just absolutely eviscerate Jim Harbaugh in those games against the 49ers, whether it was kick returns, receiving. He would just have massive games. Russell Wilson similarly step up in a lot of these big moments. Richard Sherman, Cam Chancellor, you kind of go on down the line. These guys, they never shrunk in the spotlight. And so that kind of turns this question back to, okay, so what And when you look at the current Seahawks roster through that lens, one guy stands above the rest as far as polarization and this debate about just how good he is. Is he a bridge quarterback? Is he, a true franchise player? There are people out there that have him as, one of the 5 best quarterbacks in the game, depending on when you're looking. And there's other people that are like, he's a, you know, 20th ranked quarterback and you can do a lot better. One of the things that I think really has been a flashpoint for Geno Smith, and that's who I'm talking about if you didn't figure it out, is his performance in these big moments. And actually, I'm going to set aside the moments because I want to come back to that separately in big games. And there's a lot of ways to define a big game. And the general consensus is, you know what? Geno Smith is not his best in big games. In fact, he's not good in big games. And so I went through a few different ways to define a big game. And I'll kind of give you some different cuts of this. I didn't finish all my research before the show, so I'll probably do a little bit more with you all during the show. But there's a few different categories I looked at. I looked at whether the game was in prime time. So again, that's a spotlight kind of game. You know there's going to be more attention on you. How do you do when there's more eyeballs watching your performance? 2, I looked at whether a team that they played was ultimately a playoff team. And how did you do in that situation? And that one's a little challenging in some ways because depending on when you play those teams, it can really affect the outcome. It can affect like how good they are at that moment. So a classic case of this would be the Detroit Lions in 2022. They excuse me. I thought the Detroit Lions, they were not a playoff team. Never mind. I knew I left them off the list for a reason. Ignore everything I just said about the Lions. So generally a playoff team was another group that I looked at, playoff opponents. I did kind of separate out contenders from playoff teams that were truly teams that were going to compete for a Super Bowl. And I'm realizing I missed one team off the list. And then another thing that I looked at was just divisional games. That might be a little bit more controversial. I felt like it was a pretty big deal to include divisional games in the list, given that those games are just always big. And I think the way that you perform against divisional opponents matters. So I will give you some splits that pulls the divisional games out, but ultimately, I think it's important to kind of understand how Geno performs against the division. And I'm just going through because I realized I left one team off the playoff list, and I want to make sure my splits are up to date. Okay. And let me take one more pass. I have to get all the different numbers correct in my calc. So I'm going to look through and talk to you about how Geno, like the games that fall into these different categories and how Geno performed. in these games. And there's going to be some caveats to some of these games. You know, injury situations, how other people played. So there's a few things that we will kind of look at together and make some decisions together along the way. Whoops. All right. I think we're ready. Let's go ahead and walk through some of these splits. So we'll start with overall. If I include all these categories: playoff teams, true contenders, primetime games, divisional games, I've got, let me count for you here. I have 21 games over 2 seasons. I'm only looking at Geno's Seahawks starting seasons. So that's 2022 and 2023. Got 21 games that I counted as either primetime games, divisional games, games against playoff teams, or games against true contenders for the Lombardi. Overall, in those games, Geno Smith averages 33 pass attempts, 22 completions for a 67.5% completion rate. That on its own is pretty good. It's not bad. He overall averages 235 yards in those games. And let's take a look for a second at Geno Smith's kind of overall totals to compare. So we're not just giving these numbers out. Geno in 2022 completed almost 70% of his passes, 69.8. In 2023, he completed 64.7. So has always been a high completion rate guy. 67.5 is right in the middle. And I wouldn't say it's clearly better, but it's not. I think it is better than his 2-season average. Let me go ahead and see if I can pull up his 2-season average here. That might be a little bit, it might be useful for us to look at over the course of 2 years. So at least on, completion percentage, not a crazy, not necessarily a bad thing for Geno so far. 1 second. Apologies. Team Seahawks last 2 seasons and statistics that we want to look for. Let's get completion percentage. Let's get passing yards. Let's get passer rating, and so forth. Let's see if we can pull all these in and get his 2-season average showing up here so we can reference these numbers relative to his multiple season numbers. So yeah, his 2-season average is 67.4% completion rate. So a 67.5% against these big games, I would say is right on. Got a comment here from one of our YouTube members, Peter Jacobson, who says, it's tough to judge Geno on quote big games because the team itself has been pretty meh in big games on their own. It's very true. And that's one of the caveats to all this. And I'm going to just share you the actual facts, and then we'll kind of debate and discuss what they mean and what we interpret from them. He averages 235 yards passing per game, 1.4 touchdowns, and 0.6 interceptions. So if you round, I ended up rounding up or down. That really is one touchdown and one interception. That's how I ended up getting to a passer rating of 84.8. So that 84.8 passer rating is much lower than his 2-season average of 96.8. And again, something that's just to be fair in these conversations, any team, any player that's playing against better competition is likely to have some lower numbers. Maybe that's not true, but I would bet that if you looked at Patrick Mahomes' numbers against some of his divisional opponents, the Chiefs have had some trouble with the Broncos or the Raiders at times, even though they haven't been even good teams. So, we'll see. We'll see. That's part of the point here. It would be useful to have other quarterbacks in these situations as comparables, the same way that I was able to show where Geno Smith ranks relative to other quarterbacks in terms of offensive line play, and that he's actually kind of middle of the pack to better and not as dependent on the offensive line as I think myself and others have thought. But it's helpful to have that relative information. I don't have that here. It would be really a lot of work to pull that for all the other quarterbacks and determine all their other primetime games. But in any event, Geno has a much lower passer rating overall. So I think those are the meaningful numbers I'll probably talk about with each of these splits. So again, in all 21 games that qualified as quote big games, Geno was averaged being 22 of 33, 67.5 yards, 235, 67.5% completion rate, 235 yards passing, 1.5 touchdowns, 0.6 interceptions, 84.8 passer rating. If you're curious, his best games, he had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 games where he had 100 passer rating or higher. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I missed a couple. Let's make sure and check these one more time. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 9. 9 out of the 21 games, he had a passer rating of 100 or better. And then if you include the playoff game against the 49ers, he had a 98.9 rating in that. So it's not that every game in these are bad. I was giving you the averages before. The biggest yardage total he's thrown for in a quote big game, 367 yards against the Rams. And this was in 2022. This was at LA when the Seahawks won. He also threw for over 300 yards against the Cowboys last year, threw for over 300 yards against Detroit last year. Those are his only 300 plus yard games in these quote big games. He threw for 3 touchdowns in that Rams game as well as in that Dallas game. Those are his only 3 touchdown games against, big teams, big opponents, big games. He has thrown 0 interceptions in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, roughly half of these games. And I think it's a bigger point to make that his interception rate, in fact, I actually want to calculate that real quick. his interception rate, I think, seems to be quite a bit higher in these games. So let me do a quick look at that. Um, yeah, there we go. Pull these down, and then we'll look at the average here. So, let's see. Hmm. Yeah. So his interception rate seems to be about 1.86 in these games, and his interception rate actually over the 2 seasons is 1.9. It's kind of surprising. Based on eyeballing this, I would have expected that his interception rate would be higher, but curious. Curious. I mean, he's thrown an interception in more of these games than he hasn't. He also has thrown the ball quite a bit. 33 attempts a game. That's a pretty decent number. So anyway, just looking at some of these pieces, he has had some big games in these moments, but for the most part, these are not his best games. Looking at like eyeballing these games, um, a lot of these, especially, I think. Let me take a look at touchdown rate because I think touchdown rate even might be more uh, telling. So let's take a look at this and look for what his touchdown rate was in each of these games. So if this is correct, yeah, um, his touchdown rate was 4.3, which is down a little bit. His 2-year average was 4.7. So again, not a huge difference in terms of how he's playing in these games versus some of these other contests. But let's keep going because one of the other things I was curious about was divisional games. And the Seahawks have a rough division. And so if you look at just the divisional games, and this includes the Cardinals, remember, overall, he had an 84.8 passer rating in these big games. In this, he goes 22 for 32, so a little bit less attempts. His completion percentage goes up 68.7, so highly efficient passer in that regard. His yardage goes down from 235 in all big games to 223 against the division. His touchdowns per divisional game go down to 1.3 versus 1.4 for all games. His interception rate goes up just a bit from 0.6 to 0.7. His passer rating almost oddly goes up a point from 84.8 to 85.8. His sacks notably go up from 2.4 to 2.8. So he is experiencing more pressure, getting hit more often in the divisional games. So again, these are two cuts. And so far, Geno overall in big games certainly generally steps back. And then divisionally, also a pretty reasonable step back. But let's look at primetime games, which is, by some people's definition, the way to look at big games. I don't think that's true, but I think it is one way to look at how players perform in the spotlight. And I'm including in primetime games Thursday night games, Sunday night games, Monday night games, and I also am including the playoff game that the Seahawks played in San Francisco in 2022. And so in those primetime games, Geno's attempts have gone up a decent amount. He has 35 attempts per game and he completes 24 of them. He completes a really high rate, 68.8% of his passes. His yards go quite a bit up in just primetime games, up to 246 yards per game passing. His touchdowns go up to 1.7. And even if you look at, again, his 2-year average for touchdown percentage is 4.7. His touchdown rate in these primetime games is 4.8. So he's actually throwing touchdowns at a higher rate in primetime games. His interceptions are 0.5. And so his interception rate actually goes down to 1.4% in these games. And his passer rating is a 95.7, which is pretty close to his 2-year passer rating of 96.8. I will acknowledge here because I'm doing rounding on these touchdowns and interceptions, you get a little bit of oddity. I'm not sure if the calculators I use will let me even put in fractional or decimal place on this. Let me try it. Let's see what happens. I didn't even try it the first time. Let's put in 1.7. Kind of doubt it's going to work, but let's see. It does. All right. Well, let's take a look. So that's actually a 98 passer rating. So that's higher than his others. I might have to go back and redo some things here, folks, because I did not think it would work with the decimal places. So let me do a quick refresh on a couple numbers. On that first pass through, 234, 235, 1.4, 0.6 interceptions, passer rating. See, this is very different. I'm glad this worked. This comes out with a very different number. 97.4. Is that right? 22 of 33, 235 yards, 1.4 and 0.6. Okay. Wow. Well, scratch like the last 10 minutes of the show because my numbers were incorrect. Apologies for not being perfect, but it's a Monday morning. We can all have a case of the Mondays. It's okay. But let me redo a couple things really quickly for you all so I can have the most accurate numbers. All right. Interesting. Okay. So let me do a couple. Well, I'll do these afterwards. So I had told you that it was an 84 rating. It was actually, so overall, his rating in these big games, all 21 games, I said it was like 84.8. Once that meant what I was doing there is I took 1.4 touchdowns, I rounded it down to 1, and 0.6 interceptions, and I rounded it up to 1. So it was 1 touchdown, 1 interception, and that ended up with an 84.8 rating. Well, when I actually put the actual averages he has, which is 1.4 and 0.6, his rating goes to 97.4, which is a pretty huge difference and is higher than his 2-season average of 96.8. So overall, in big games, his passer rating is higher than it is in non-big games. That's a pretty big difference than what I just said. And then I looked at the divisional games, and again, he had 1.3 touchdowns and 0.7 interceptions. That had been an 85.8 because, again, I was rounding down or up. When I put it in accurately, the passer rating is 98. Is that right? Yeah, 98.8. So his passer rating in divisional games is considerably higher than it is for, his typical game, which is shocking to me. I mean, I'm like double checking my numbers since I made a mistake. Maybe I'm making more mistakes, but let's look at this again. I mean, he's got an 80 rated game against the 49ers, 82 against the Cardinals, 106.9 against the Cardinals, 116 against the Rams. 90.9 against the 49ers, 84.1 against the Rams, 116. Oops, sorry, that's the right run. 113 against the Cardinals, 94 against the Rams, 70 against the 49ers, 101.6 against the Cardinals, 98.9 against the 49ers. So these are, I mean, a number of these games, he's had some pretty good games against the Rams and the Cardinals. If I just looked at his games against the 49ers, I bet the answer is a little bit different. What do you guys say? Can we take a moment and let me just do the 49ers? Actually, I think I can just do the splits. Never mind. I don't even have to. Well, let's just do it. Versus 49ers. And let's do average of these particular games. I bet his average against the 49ers is not so good. Is that right? Only 2, 3, 4. I feel like we're missing a 49ers game in here somewhere. Let's just take a look at what I've got and see where that leaves us. So, all right. So, just against the 49ers, he averages 34 attempts and completes 25 of them for 217 yards, 0.8 touchdowns, and 0.8 interceptions. So how can that possibly be an 89.95 passer rating? That does not seem right. Anyone else thinks that sounds wrong? Let's check one other place and see if they agree with that calculation. 34 attempts, 25 completions, 217 yards, 0.8 touchdowns, 0.8 interceptions, 87. Well, they come up with a slightly different 87, basically an 88 rating, but it's not that far off. So 89.9. It's not great, but it's not awful. I would have thought it would have been worse. So that's kind of fascinating. I think he plays better, certainly against some of the other. He's played pretty well against the Rams, to be honest. He's had quite a few good games. He's had some really bad games. But for the most part, I think the Rams games have been a little bit better for him. If I look at his games against just playoff teams, playoff contenders, and so forth, in those games, he takes 35 attempts, completes 23 for 233 yards. He averages 1.2 touchdowns and 0.5 interceptions, which is a 94.1 rating. That's down from his 2-season average of 96.8. But I think the other way to kind of look at this is, I mean, in general, we're just talking passer rating. I know that there's a lot of folks that are anti-passer rating as a number to look at for quarterbacks. And I still find it a decent measure of efficiency, at least. Geno's not hugely different in these different cuts of games. I guess I honestly expected to see some pretty big dips in his passer ratings in these games. Like the 49ers one, to me, makes more sense. Like that's kind of what I expected. Him averaging the same amount of touchdowns as he does throw interceptions against them. The 49ers, I think in particular, jump out and those games jump out to people because that team is so good and the Seahawks have just fallen on their face so often in those games the last couple of years that, I think people attribute that to Geno. I think a lot of teams get their butts kicked by the 49ers. So I don't think that's quite as damning as maybe the casual fan would think. But I look at some of these games. I mean, his game against the Chiefs a couple years ago, not great. 25 of 40, one touchdown, one interception, 74.5 passer rating. I'm really skeptical about these passer rating numbers, to be honest, guys, because I don't know how he's getting into the 90s with these relatively low numbers, but I might have to come back and do a little bit of that on my own time. But in any event, he's had some. If I just average his passer ratings, let me just do this for a second. Gonna create another column, copy all this stuff over, paste, and we're gonna just do that. Anyway, it's clear to me that Geno has some pretty bad games against big opponents. But you also look at some of the games he's had when he played the Bucks that Super Bowl year in London. He completed 70% of his passes, threw for 275 yards, 2 touchdowns, and no interceptions. I don't think he shrunk in that game. When he played against the Giants in 2022, I know it's hard to remember, but that was a playoff team that won a playoff game and was playing very well, and their defense especially was playing really well. Geno was 23 for 34, completed 67.5% of his passes, threw 2 touchdowns, no interceptions, 104 rating. That first game against the Broncos, his first start, might be hard to remember. That was just a electric game. It was such a big game. So much was on the line. If you're going to have butterflies, if you're going to play nervous, that would be the game to do it. He came out and completed 82% of his passes through 2 touchdowns and no interceptions. And if you look at the team's overall record in this 21 games I'm talking about, these are the primetime division games, playoff opponents. Your record's not going to necessarily be its best. No one's going to have their best record here. The Seahawks have won 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So they are 10 and 11 in these, quote, big games. That's not great, but this has not been a great Seahawks team, and they have been right around 500. So for them to be 10 and 11 in these games, it's not quite as damning as I would have expected. And I think there's a few games that loom large. The Baltimore game last year, Geno was 13 of 28, 157 yards, 0 touchdowns, 1 interception. You look at the Lions game last year. That was obviously a pretty huge game against a very good team. Geno goes 32 of 41, completes 78% of his passes for 328 yards, 2 touchdowns, no interceptions. I think the Dallas game last year, really big moment. Prime time, goes 23 of 41, which is actually a pretty low completion rate for him. It's only 56%, but 334 yards, 3 touchdowns, 1 interception. And a 97 rating. So, you know, and you look at the Pittsburgh game last year, which was a game against a playoff team, against a great defense that the team needed for the playoffs. Geno was electric in that game. So I don't know if it's as clear cut as we'd like it to be that Geno is, yeah, he hasn't come through in big games. From what I am looking at with the actual numbers, there's people could point to certain games and say that's true. But you can also point to a lot of these games and say it's just not. Maybe the biggest game of all of these was the playoff game against the 49ers 2 years ago when the Seahawks were even worse and the 49ers were even better as far as I'm concerned that year. And Geno was playing a absolutely he had a perfect first half. I mean, he made some huge throws to DK Metcalf, had the Seahawks ahead in that game through 3 quarters. And even overall, once he had some, some turnovers, had a fumble, had an interception, he was 25 to 35, completed 71% of his passes for 253 yards, 2 touchdowns, an interception, and a 98.9 passer rating. I don't think that that's a, man, Geno's not a big game quarterback kind of performance. If you look at Dak Prescott has thrown multiple interceptions. I'll even pull it up. Let's pull it up. Dak Prescott in the playoffs has not been his best. Let's pull up Dak Prescott. Let's look at his playoff splits. Do they have playoff splits? There we go. Yeah, he's got a 91.8 passer rating in the playoffs overall in 7 games, 2-5 record, 0-3 against divisional opponent. Oh, in the divisional round. In the divisional round, he has an 88.3 rating, has thrown 5 touchdowns, 3 interceptions. He's really had some stinkers in the postseason. Why won't that show me the postseason? Show me postseason. There we go. He had 2, I think, very good games in the playoffs, at least numbers wise. He had believe it or not, against Green Bay. Oh no, this is 2017. That's why I was going to say last year, but it was definitely not last year. His first playoff game, he went 24 of 38, 302 yards, 3 touchdowns, 1 interception, 103 rating. He had another good game against Tampa Bay in 2022, where he went 25 of 33, 305 yards, 4 touchdowns, no interceptions, 143 rating. But every other game, pretty much, he's been pretty bad. And he's thrown multiple interceptions in his last 2 playoff games. Last year against Green Bay, year before against the 49ers. So I'm just bringing up Dak Prescott as an example of a guy who has shrunk quite a bit in the playoffs. Geno's 1 game in the playoffs, his numbers were actually better than his seasonal averages. So you could argue that he stepped up and played some of his better football against a really, really good opponent on the road. The other thing I wanted to do was take a look at not just Geno Smith in big games, but kind of in big moments. And there's a lot of ways to do this. I have not done the prep work for this yet, but what I wanted to look at was to see if I could find, excuse me, during specific situations over the last 2 years. And feel free to throw out some criteria you'd be interested in. But I'm going to go from 2022 to 2023. Let me clear my throat so you don't have to keep hearing this. All right. In 2022 to 2023, let's look at situations where Let's just look in the last 2 minutes of games. Time remaining. I wish I could get score differential. Maybe I can, maybe I can't. Let's look at the last 5 minutes of games. And let's scoring margin. Cool. Let's say it's -7, so they're within a touchdown, okay, but you're trailing to tied. So we'll say between a tied game and down by 7 points, 5 minutes remaining, and we'll say in the fourth quarter. Okay? So how does Geno perform in those moments? And compared to other quarterbacks. Let me make sure I've got the right criteria here. Fourth quarter, 5 minutes remaining, -7, between 7-point deficit, 1 score deficit, and 0 points. And let's take a look at how people perform in these situations. I'm curious where Geno will fall among quarterbacks. Let me make some edits here because there's some guys showing up. Well, I don't have to. I can do it in my head. Geno Smith in games over the past 2 seasons where his team is either down by like 7 points or tied, like somewhere in between. They could be down by 6, 5, 4, 3, anywhere in there. 5 minutes left in the game, fourth quarter. How does he perform in those moments? He has a 103.2 passer rating in those moments. He's thrown 5 touchdowns, only 1 interception. That is good for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That's 10th in the NFL over that time. Number 1, CJ Stroud was 15-19 last year. He had 147.6 rating in those situations. That's pretty impressive for the rookie. Jake Browning shows up on this list. He was 11 for 13 for 90 yards, 1 touchdown, no interceptions. That's a 121 rating in those situations. Matt Ryan, he's no longer out there, but he was still doing the clutch thing in his last few games. He had 113.8 rating. Joe Burrow had 110.9. Dak Prescott, 109.7. Josh Allen, 109.3. Baker Mayfield, 105.8. And Geno Smith, 103.2. To give you an idea, like Jared Goff in those situations, often compared to Geno Smith, 86.3 rating. Not nearly as good. Kyler Murray, 85.6 rating. If you're curious, Sam Howell in those situations, 78.4 rating, not good. Justin Herbert, often considered one of the best quarterbacks in football, 77.5 rating. Has thrown as many interceptions as he did touchdowns in those situations. Interesting looking down this list. Patrick Mahomes. Holy moly, guys. Patrick Mahomes in these situations, when there's 5 minutes or less to go, his team is trailing or tied by 1 score or less, and it's in the fourth quarter, right? Patrick Mahomes is 17 of 38, 45% completion rate, 182 yards, 1 touchdown, 2 interceptions for a 46.2 rating. That's wild. Would any of you have guessed that Patrick Mahomes would be down here with guys like Gardner Minshew, uh, that's crazy. Worth noting, Jalen Hurts is right there with him at 47 passer rating. You got some pretty notable quarterbacks that not playing that well, not playing their best in those big moments. Brock Purdy. This is often a criticism of Purdy, which is how can he play when his team's behind since they're always ahead? In these situations, he is 11 for 22, completing 50% of his passes for 175 yards, no touchdowns, one interception for a 58 rating. I don't know. I mean, I think that that's a pretty telling indicator. There's one other thing I want to look at, if you guys will give me a chance to do it. Let me see if I can pull this up and if it will show. Let's look at, again, just over the last 2 seasons, 2022 to 2023. And let's look at I think I can look up whether there are fourth quarter comebacks. Let's see if I can grab this or not. Yes. Quarterback game-winning drive. Yes. Okay, let's look at game-winning drives over the last 2 seasons. And I actually am pulling all of them, so let's do let's look at this. So if we it's doing it by fantasy points. No, let's do it by games. Three players have 8 game-winning drives in the last 2 seasons. Josh Allen, Kirk Cousins, Geno Smith. 8 game-winning drives. So I know some people are like, hey, well, game-winning drives means that you're behind and or that you're in a close game and these other guys maybe just don't have that. Fine. I mean, that is one way to look at it. But Josh Allen, Bills have not been a bad team, and he is one of those players. Geno Smith also has led 6 fourth quarter comebacks over that period of time. That's behind only Kirk Cousins and Russell Wilson, interestingly. He's 1 ahead of Josh Allen, Jared Goff, Justin Herbert. Patrick Mahomes has 5. So Geno Smith has more fourth quarter comebacks than some of these guys. I think where I'm kind of ending up on this note for Geno Smith is a little inconclusive. I came into this fully expecting the data to show that Geno Smith is not a big game quarterback yet, and this is an area where he really needs to prove himself. I think generally that's still true, but I don't think it's nearly as damning. The numbers are nearly as damning as I expected them to be. And what Seattle fans need to think about here is you can have whatever narrative you want about Geno Smith, about whether he is a big game quarterback, whether he's great, whether he's mediocre, all those kinds of things. But the numbers in almost all cases have said Geno Smith is a very good quarterback. And to the point that was made earlier by our YouTube member, Peter Jacobson, um, I think you got to be careful about mixing up the quality of the players around your quarterback in these games and the quarterback himself. By my eye, Geno Smith has not played his most confident, smart games consistently in some of these big moments. And I have to admit, a big part of what's coloring that perception is these games against the 49ers, who I so terribly want him to beat. And he has not performed that well, other than the playoff game, which I thought he was brilliant for a lot of that game. He has not stepped up against the 49ers. And so there's a lot of reasons for that. There's a lot of players that didn't step up well in those games. But I still think Geno needs to, I almost could narrow this to Geno needs to play well against the 49ers. He has already played well against the Rams a number of times. But I think he's got to do it against the 49ers. So I don't think that there's evidence to say that Geno Smith is not a big game quarterback. I think there is evidence to say that Geno Smith is one of the best clutch quarterbacks in tight moments. He's done that multiple times. Among the best in the NFL. But this is going to be the year. There's not going to be, I don't think there's going to be any sort of gray area. I think he's got the right OC, the right set of receivers, hopefully an offensive line that isn't just atrocious like it was last year, and hopefully a better running game. He has not had a good running game. If I looked at these big games and I looked at the running game that the Seahawks had trotted out there, it's not good, folks. And I can tell you all the pressure that was on Geno because the running game wasn't always its best. I think one of the games it was strongest was in the playoff game. They actually came out and were running the ball pretty well for a lot of that game. And I think a key to beating the 49ers this year is going to be running the ball down their throats. I think that's going to be a big difference. All right, everybody. If you haven't given the show a like and click subscribe, please do. I really appreciate it, and it also helps other people find the show. We really want to grow the community here, keep this group growing, have a lot of fun together. The more likes and subscribes we get, the more we can do that. If you aren't already a Patreon member, patreon.com/hawkblogger gets you access to all the ad-free audio editions of this pod. I think you'll enjoy having those, as well as access to the Slack channel where we have the conversation continue all the time. Everybody, have a wonderful rest of your Monday. It's been great checking in with you today. This has been episode 113 of Hawk Blogger Mornings. I am Brian Nemhauser. Take care.